Again, the Space Shuttle Challenger has crashed, exploded in midair just after launch from the Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral. It is now in the water. All 7 astronauts on board are presumed dead. Judy?
Well, Jim, Ron Claiborne is downtown with our live remote unit right now. He is talking with some people down there. Ron, let's go to you.
Judy, we're at the Metropolitan Improvement Company. That's a bar and restaurant across the street from police headquarters, where there are about 15 or 20 patrons here at the bar, where they have 2 large screen televisions watching the live reports of the disaster down there in Florida. Sir, what is your name?
My name is Gregory Gubatoza.
Now, were you in here when the liftoff occurred and it exploded?
No, I wasn't.
Okay, you came in at what point?
After the disaster.
When you saw it, when you learned about it, watched it on television, what was going through your mind at that moment?
Well, it was a spectacular disaster.
Now, you told me that you had actually applied to be the teacher in space yourself?
Yes, this is a very interesting circumstance for me because there was a teacher on this mission, and I had applied for that spot myself.
Okay. Sir, what is your name?
Joe Annunziano.
Okay, were you in here watching the newscast live? How did you happen to see what happened? How did you learn about it?
On the instant replay.
What was going through your mind when you saw something like that?
Shock, disbelief. It's horrible. And, you know, unexpected. Just, it just doesn't seem possible, you know. I thought they pretty much had this down pat, as you might understand, and I know I have a son that was very much interested in the space program, and I'm sure he must be wondering, because he's home too today, and I just think that it's a setback, you know, and I just feel, you know, nothing but numbness.
Well, that pretty much represents the sentiments we're getting here at the bar. In Lower Manhattan, people are watching the coverage very closely, feeling very sad on an occasion like this, a tragedy, and we'll be following this closely from New York City. Now back to you in the studio to Judy and Jim.
Well, Ron, we wonder whether, in fact, if you are still there, whether most people in the street seem to know about this tragedy when you were setting up for the shot, whether you had a sense that people out there knew.
Well, shortly after it occurred, because it occurred before noon, when most people are still at work, most people we spoke to had not heard anything, had no idea even that the shuttle was taking off at that particular moment. But within 15 or 20 minutes, either by word of mouth or those people who were watching television or listening to radio accounts, the word spread very quickly. The reaction immediately was one of shock, disbelief, as you would imagine, and later, as it turned out, apparently with all 7 members of the crew dead, there was tremendous sadness.
Ron, I know that before this tragedy struck, you were at City Hall, all prepared to go live in connection with the Donald Maness story. I wonder, did you have a chance to talk to any of the politicians down there, any of the elected officials, the people who represent us in local government, and ask them what their reaction to this tragedy was?
No, Jim, we had left City Hall at the time this occurred, and people we've been speaking to have just been average citizens on the street and here in the restaurant and bar.
Okay, thank you very much, Ron. Let's go now to a tape of Krista McAuliffe. Krista McAuliffe is the one teacher who was aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. Back in July of 1985, when she was first chosen to be the first teacher to go into space, we did this interview.
The training will start in September.
Did you think that you were ever going to fail in any part of the testing?
No, that wasn't really part of the evaluation process. So even if I had gotten sick on it, I'd still be all right.
Were you surprised by any of the testing or anything? Did you think it was harder than?
The intensity of it, just lots and lots of things crammed into a week. I mean, we were just running from early in the morning till late at night.
Do you think that was part of the training or the testing?
Well, maybe, but I think they knew that we only had us for a short period of time. They were just trying to cram in as much as possible so that we could really experience everything that we could in that short period of time.
Scott said today you were going to take one of his pet frogs along on the flight. Is that going to be one of the pieces of the cargo?
Yes, we're going to put that frog right on the shuttle.
This is Scott?
This is Scott.
Scott, does the frog have a name yet?
Yeah.
Legal the frog is going to go into space? That's part of the deal. Did NASA know about this?
I do have a personal compartment on board the shuttle. I can take some things along with me. Not big enough for any of you, but...
But actually, have you seen the inside? You must have seen the inside of one of these things.
Yeah.
A personal compartment. How comfortable is
It's
it?
probably about this big and about that wide, so that you can bring some things that you would like to
Personal
bring.
effects?
Yeah. Some T-shirts that you're going to wear, and some things for your family.
What kind of T-shirts are you going to wear?
Oh, I don't know. I'll have to get a good New Hampshire one.
Can you tell us about the camaraderie between you and the other 9 finalists?
Oh, it's just wonderful. It really is. I mean, we went through so much. All I can liken it to is having a small bunch of big kids go through kisses.
Kristen, finally, what's it like?
Where's Bitty Bob? She's at home. She's resting. Oh, she's resting? Oh, who's with her? Oh.
Now it's 20 seconds. It's a long 20 seconds. Is this like a countdown?
She will now start any minute. I don't know.
Dion, Kristen is here with me now. She just got off the plane a while ago, and I know that you were chosen for this mission partly because of your disposition. You've been giggling since you got here. Tell me. Why, again, you've said it so many times, why is this so important to you, making this trip on the shuttle?
Well, it's important for a lot of reasons, but I think the most important thing is to humanize the space age to a point where everybody feels a part of it, and the students really connect with that. They're the wave of the future. They're the ones who are going to have to deal with the space stations and beyond, and I really hope and feel that it's part of the teaching profession to bring those new career opportunities. I know, it's wonderful.
Okay, all right, so how's it feel to be back in New Hampshire?
It feels great to be home. I am really delighted because I kept hearing about all of these wonderful things that people were doing while I was down in Washington, while I was down in Houston, and I couldn't share with that. And Steve would tell me on the phone, and he'd say, you got some letters, or, people called, and I couldn't share with that. So I'm really glad I'm home.
A sad interview indeed in light of what just happened. There was no indication whether the explosion occurred in the solid boosters or in the main engines fueled by hydrogen and oxygen. Mission Control reported there was no indication of any problems with the engines. And as we told you, that shuttle was filled with fuel, as a matter of fact, carrying more than 500,000 gallons of fuel. And it was the first in-flight disaster in 56 United States manned space missions. Judy?
Well, Jim, as we mentioned, there were 7 crew members aboard that shuttle, including Krista McAuliffe, the 37-year-old New Hampshire teacher who was the first teacher in space. You just saw a profile of her. The other crew members were Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, and Gregory Jarvis. Jim?
All right, Judy, let's go to a tape now. CNN was taping the McAuliffe family as they were watching the mission. Let's go to that tape now.
Video just sent via satellite. Picture you were just seeing was Christian McAuliffe's parents watching in horror. These are the students from her school. Many of them probably had their view blocked just as we did with the television cameras, with just a huge fireball and a huge cloud of smoke. They may not realize yet what has happened. You see concern etched on their faces. The breath that they've been holding released. And then the realization sets in that something is wrong. At that point, all that remained was...
Flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
Edward and Grace Corrigan. They were about 3.5 miles away from the area of the launch pad and the VIP launch area. Families of the astronauts normally in the grandstands.
Tom, as John Zarella pointed out from the Cape earlier, when all of us first...
You were watching the relatives of the astronauts as they watched as the terrible orange ball filled up the sky, indicating that the crash had taken place and their loved ones were lost. Let's go once again now and replay that explosion. It was just before noon, about 11:38, when the Space Shuttle Challenger took off from Cape Canaveral and looked like this.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
Tom, everything looks normal to this point?
It's about 20 seconds.
Everything looks normal to this point. It's when the long-range tracking cameras took over, and you could see an extreme close-up as the solid rocket boosters appear to be breaking away from the shuttle and then explode. It comes up in just a few seconds here.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude.
You know, it just looked like a 4th of July fireworks explosion, and certainly the most tragic incident to ever befall the space program. At least at this point, it seems that way. That's about all I really know.
John,
Rescue teams are now being allowed to enter the area of the Atlantic where the Space Shuttle debris has fallen. It's about 9 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. That debris, by the way, is continuing to rain down from the sky more than close to an hour after the explosion. Again, there is no word on the fate of the astronauts, but they are presumed dead.
The disaster at the Kennedy Space Center is, of course, a setback for the nation's space program. It will probably be months from now before another space shuttle can be launched as engineers try to determine just what went wrong. And the explosion occurred about 60 seconds into the flight at a point when the astronauts were beginning to throttle their engines up to maximum thrust. And, of course, that concludes our coverage of the crash of the Space Shuttle Challenger. We'll be bringing you more information throughout the day as it develops. Midday Live is coming up next. I'll have a special edition devoted to this rather tragic story. For First Edition News and Jim Ryan, I'm Judy Licht.
All right, we are joined. I'm Bill Boggs here with you on Midday Live. Thank you, Judy and Jim. We are joined together now on a live program, a day of grim tragedy, a day when our lives are filled with unreal pictures, truly unreal pictures of the Space Shuttle Challenger exploding. With me right now is Ken Gilmore, editor of Popular Science magazine, a scientist and writer who's been covering the space race and space for a long time. Ken, you've been down there in Florida to see the launches, and let's begin by going back to the last really vivid and tragic pictures as we saw the faces of the astronauts' families and Miss McAuliffe, the school teacher. What is it like at a launch? How much do you really know about what's going on when you see the rocket take off?
Well, mostly what you see is what you know. However, the loudspeaker is going so that you can hear mission control counting down and saying pressures are normal and we're now at 2 miles and so on. So you're getting a sort of blow-by-blow, but nothing like the kind of description you get on television, for example.
So it's difficult really to comprehend when we saw only the faces of those people. What could have been going through their minds when they saw that fireball erupt as the Challenger exploded?
I'm sure for a moment each one assumed that it was something benign. You know, when the various boosters separate, there is a little flash of flame. So you're prepared for that, and I'm sure at first they thought it was that, but it was very quickly obvious that something was terribly wrong.
Now, as I understand it, this horrible explosion took place at a time when they were calling for a throttle up, when they were going to get yet another boost. What, in your view, and I know this is all speculation, but that's all we have really, could cause an accident of this magnitude?
Bill, I'm going to have to fail you on that one. I have no idea. A spacecraft of this type is the most complicated machine that has ever been put together in the history of the Earth. There are literally hundreds of thousands of things that all have to work. Something important went wrong. I hope that we will eventually find out what it is. Now, we've had other accidents, as you know, such as the explosion aboard Apollo 13 when it was headed for the moon. For a long time, nobody knew what caused that, but gradually, through an incredible amount of detective work, it was traced back to a single contact on a single switch. And I suspect that will happen here over the next month or years.
You know, those of us like myself who are old enough to recall that day in July when our crew landed on the moon, and those of us who can remember going back to our first circumnavigation of the Earth, I don't think we take it for granted. I think that we sense the danger that's implicit and involved in this. And I think maybe for younger people watching, people who only see this on television and who have not lived through any of these disasters, that this is a true eye-opening experience as we see how truly dangerous and how heroic and brave these astronauts and a simple school teacher from New Hampshire have to be to get into this craft.
Well, you know, those of us who have covered this for 25 years now, we've always known, and I have had many discussions in bars after launches and so on, someday we're going to lose one. And what will the reaction be? I mean, in aviation that we've developed over the last 75 years or so, thousands and thousands of people have been killed. And if you want to look at it that way, I guess it's the price of development. The space program, in some form, will undoubtedly continue in this country and elsewhere, and there will be deaths from time to time.
We know that if we study the history of our quest for space, there has long been, in fact, in today's New York Times, there's an article addressing the question of whether or not we actually need to send human beings into space. We certainly know about our far-flung Voyager that's been out for 8 years now. That obviously has no human beings on it. What's your personal view on this? Is it really necessary for us to be sending humans up, or could we accomplish the same scientific goals simply by sending computers and robots and sensitive machinery?
Let me give you the best answer I ever heard, which I didn't make up. But in about 1970, I did a special on this program right after that first Apollo flight you were talking about, and it was called Why Go Back to the Moon Again? And we had Bob Jastrow, who is one of the NASA officials,
I'd like to
as
point
a
out
guest.
Bob Jastrow will be on our program today on the phone. Go ahead.
Well, at any rate, I said, why do we have to do this? He said, it is in the spirit of man. Once we get the technology to develop air flight, we're going to develop it, and we will then find a reason to use it. Once we can have in our grasp the ability to develop space flight, we're going to do it. And that was his answer. I think you can argue that we get a lot more return, scientifically and otherwise, for our money on unmanned spacecraft. Look at this Voyager 2 that we are just seeing now. It has been going 8.5 years. It cost a relatively small number of millions of dollars, if I can use that term, which is ridiculous to me when I'm broke most of the time. But it costs a relatively small amount of money compared to something like the shuttle program, yet it has been producing results for 8.5 years and will no doubt produce them for some time more. There are many people who are arguing for more money spent this way, less money spent on manned programs, and that is undoubtedly an argument that will be canted very sharply in one direction by this accident today.
Maybe we should take a moment and really review the mission of the Challenger and the Space Shuttle program in general. Because, again, I think one mission folds into the next and things tend to be confused. Let's review it.
Well, if you mean these specific missions or the overall long-range goal?
Let's take the overall long-range goal and then the specific mission that this craft was on.
Well, this actual craft had several experiments which are a continuation of various scientific things that are going on. Overall, the shuttle, when it was developed many years ago, when the program was started, it was hypothesized that it would be able to deliver payload into orbit at a far lower cost than the single one-time throwaway rockets that we were using up until that time. I can remember numbers that it would be 1/100th as much for 1 pound into orbit. That has not turned out to be true. It has become much more expensive than originally was thought. However, the goal is still to deliver large loads into space. Communication satellites, for example. Something like the shuttle would be very important if we're ever to have the President's Star Wars program that he wants. You're going to have to get a lot of tons of things
up
into
there
space.
in order to build the necessary
and
equipment.
Something like that, the shuttle or its descendants, would be needed for any program of that type.
Obviously, the official, no official word has been pronounced on this, but I think it's safe to assume that this does not deter our quest for space. But yet, let's examine, again, it's speculation. What are the ramifications of a tragedy like this? The emotional as well as the scientific ramifications.
Obviously, I heard Larry Speaks a little while ago on television, and he was asked questions about, are we going to have to review the program and so on, and he's saying, well, it's much too early for that, and we cannot give any answer to that at the moment. Obviously, everything comes to a dead halt today, and there are going to be groups of people in Congress, in government, in NASA, everywhere, sitting around for the next weeks and months saying, what should we do? What caused that? What effect should this have? Does this make us rethink things? There will be a total wall-to-wall re-evaluation of this whole thing.
On a recent flight, we saw a senator, Jake Garn, go into space. In this tragedy, a school teacher, a private citizen, was going into space. Does a tragedy of this magnitude potentially affect the private sector's participation in government flights like this?
It's an interesting question, and one that I feel very personally. I'd like to tell you something at this moment, and I hope this doesn't seem too self-centered at a time of tragedy like this. As you know, on January 15th, the time expired for which people, journalists, could apply to fly on the shuttle. Needless to say, I was one of those who applied. About an hour before this tragedy this morning, I got back this little card from NASA that says, this will confirm receipt of your application to be the first journalist in space. I will tell you, I have a spooky feeling looking at this card.
I can truly understand that. I think that most people watching now are evaluating that question. Again, I'll go back to my point. I think that for many of us, we came to take this enormous scientific accomplishment and all of the attendant risks kind of for granted. You know, we see a plane taking off, plane lands. We trust technology. On a day like today, we recognize the limits and the risks involved.
But we also are ready to accept a certain percentage of plane crashes for the benefit that we get from it.
That we absolutely do. Now, what do you feel will be within the next 2 decades accomplished by the billions of dollars we're pouring into space? Frequently we'll have guests on Midday who will say, you know, it's great, we're sending a lot up, but you know, we still have problems in the South Bronx. We're not educating children. We have hungry people. What do we get from
That's the old, if we can send a man to the moon, why can't we cure cancer? Which is a totally illogical question. Sure, there are many social things that we need. There are many unmet needs in the world. But why don't we say television is frivolous? Why don't we stop all television and take those hundreds of millions of dollars and use them to feed starving people? The point is, a diverse society has many hundreds and thousands of ways that it spends its money, and this is one that
I guess what I was aiming at quickly in that question was what we will get from the next 10 to 20 years in space. And why don't we do this? We can think this over. Take a break. We're going to be joined by Gurney Williams, who is the editor of Omni magazine, and he can jump into that question as well as we stay with you on a day of tragedy for America. We'll return right after this.
Could you just do a quick audio check?
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
The office people still gathered around.
Welcome back to our Midday. We're live right now, and in case you've just tuned in and have not heard the news, the tragic news is that the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded about 90 seconds after takeoff, just totally burst into flames in air. If you haven't seen the tape, you'll be seeing it plenty of times. This is indeed a grim day, and as I said when we first came on the air here, a day of unreal pictures, pictures that will stay with you and really with the history of our country forever. With us now is Gurney Williams. He joins Ken Gilmore and myself. Gurney is the editor of Omni magazine. Gurney, you just spoke briefly before we were coming back of the emotional experience for you in the past of watching a launch. Just share that with us.
Any normal launch, Bill, is an emotional experience. And I remember one specifically in which I tried to record the launch for my children with a small tape recorder. And I tried to be Walter Cronkite for a few minutes, and I was unable to speak after the launch. Bear in mind that you don't hear the sound for many seconds after the vehicle begins to rise into the air. It looks beautiful. It looks quiet. You can hear swamp noises. And then, seconds later, the sound rolls over you. It is as if the heavens are being torn apart. And at that point, I stopped talking. A normal launch is an emotional experience for anyone. And this one, of course, much more so.
Gurney, when we paused briefly, I was asking Ken the question of what do you feel that the rewards will be of our space program over the next, say, 10 to 20 years, and not raising the old, you know, why can't we cure cancer if we're going to the moon questions. What do you see the benefits and some of the questionable drawbacks of all this money that's going in?
It's an extremely difficult time to talk about benefits. Yeah. When we see the faces of the families and the children. But I do think it's important to remember that NASA has been through difficult times before. In the late 50s, virtually all of their rockets blew up on the pad, and I remember in 1967, when I was a young journalist, the Apollo tragedy in which 3 men died on the ground in an explosion and fire. NASA survived those crises, and I think it's likely that the agency will survive these crises as well, and there are a number of payoffs that we can look forward to. And as I say, it's difficult to talk about them now, but just for starters, NASA has brought us riches in the way of information about our planet and others, information of use to farmers. We have made money with that knowledge, and I think we will in the future.
I'm just informed we have a few people on the line with phone calls or questions, and when we came on, I said we share this day of tragedy together, so I'm happy to hear from one of our viewers. This is Bill Boggs with you on Midday. Hello.
Good morning, Bill.
Good morning.
This is Matt from Brooklyn.
Yes, Matt.
I'd like to ask your panel, what effect did the weather have on the shuttle tragedy?
You know, I'm glad you asked that, because there seemed to be a lot of delays. It was going to go and it wasn't going to go, it was going to go, it wasn't going to go. Any possibility that the weather could have affected this?
I'm not aware of any way. The real answer to that question is we simply have no idea. That shuttle is set to operate at very high altitudes in very cold weather. So, you know, there's nothing about cold that would make it not function. There was some talk about icicles falling off and possibly damaging something, but that is not an unusual feature of launches. If the weather was implicated, there's simply no evidence of it at the moment. That's as much as I could say.
Yes? I think we should point out that NASA has been extraordinarily careful about launching in any other than ideal conditions. They always go up when the weather's fine. It's unlikely, although at this point, of course, we don't know.
All right, Matt, thank you. Let's go to another caller. Bill Boggs here with you on Midday. Hello.
Hello, my name is Van. I'm calling from Jersey City.
Yes, Van.
And, to my advantage, earlier today I heard on the news that the space shuttle was not supposed to go up before Thursday. And today when I came home for looking for a job, I heard it blew up. And what made them, reschedule the plane to go up so soon?
I didn't hear that.
I wasn't aware of that
It
myself.
wasn't supposed to go up. I suspect maybe what was said is the decision hadn't been made, and if it didn't go today, it wouldn't go until Thursday. But that's pure supposition on my part. Did you hear anything about it?
I hadn't heard anything. Of course, the launch today came after several delays, as have the previous few launches.
Okay, thanks. More callers, just let me know. 570-1199. Gurney, as I understand it, there were 15 launches of these shuttles scheduled for this year?
That's right, and that schedule is almost certainly out the window. They were ambitious launches. The next one was to go up and look at Halley's Comet. That's almost certainly postponed and now lost because the comet will then, of course, be gone. This was the year that the journalist was to be selected. We don't have any idea what's to happen with that program. There are a number of other things that NASA is doing.
Hold on that just a second. Ken, you're really speculating that you think that may be shelved for a while as a result of what's going on today.
I think it will certainly be postponed and maybe canceled. I think maybe the whole question of whether to take non-crewmen up will be re-examined, and it may indeed, the decision may be not to.
Right. Yeah, this is a great deal of the emotional impact today resulted from the fact that there was a teacher aboard. It certainly affected me, and it's akin to a civilian dying in battle. We cannot forget the astronauts, as we cannot forget soldiers in battle. But the fact is there was a teacher aboard. She was the first, and her children were watching her, and that is crippling.
Yes.
It is painful to close your eyes and imagine what is going on now in Concord High School, what the atmosphere must be like. The sense of disbelief as it was reported, as the children were watching on the screen and saw the explosion, and they said, this can't be real.
And I think as a country, we simply have to go through a bit of a grieving process. After that, as with most grieving processes, I do think we will pick it up again. I do think we will start over, as we did in the late 50s, as we did after 1967. I think we can do it. This country has recovered before, and I think we will again.
Let's take a pause, and we'll return with Midday Live right after this. Welcome back. You're rejoining us live on Midday as we discuss the tragic explosion in midair of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Our guests are Ken Gilmore, the editor of Popular Science magazine, Gurney Williams, editor of Omni magazine. Without getting into physics and thrust numbers and so forth, let's discuss a little bit, as best we can in layman's terms even, what actually goes on when this rocket takes off, and give us an insight into the risks involved. Again, we take it for granted. We see it go up. It looks beautiful. What is actually happening?
The first couple of minutes of flight are actually among the riskiest couple of minutes in any shuttle plan, because the shuttle is going through a period of terrific forces. That is, it breaks the sound barrier, it shakes, it pushes, and it shudders, and NASA has always recognized these first 2 minutes as a challenge. At the same time, there is very little that an astronaut aboard can do to escape if anything goes wrong. People see atop the shuttle a big rocket-like post that sticks up. It's often assumed that that's an escape rocket. It is not. It's a lightning rod, basically.
A lightning rod.
It's two.
Now, there was talk at one point of a parachute with some kind of an escape capsule coming down. I think this was mistakenly representative. It may have even been a paramedic going into the water. Does such a thing exist? Is there any possibility that anyone could be saved?
Certainly, the astronauts are not equipped with parachutes, anything like that.
That probably was either a paramedic or an engineer. Obviously, NASA has all kinds of backup plans for any eventuality, including this one. And one of the important things is, if this happens, to get out there and get as many of those pieces as possible. So they are standing there waiting, and they were out there within a minute or two jumping into the water, but that was undoubtedly.
We have some other viewers on the line, so let me get in touch with you right now. This is Bill Boggs here with you on Midday. Hello.
Hello, this is Eileen from Manhattan.
Yes, Eileen.
First, I want to say that how like a personal tragedy this is. My phone has been ringing since this happened. It's incredible how personally we're taking it. But my question is, what next? How do we find out what happened? Do they fish the pieces out of the sea? How long will it take?
Might we ever find out, actually?
Yeah.
The chances are pretty good. The main evidence that is going to be available is telemetry. When a vehicle like that takes off, there are literally scores and maybe hundreds of radio signals coming back, telling all kinds of pressures, temperatures, buffeting, much information. Obviously, that stopped at the time that it was blown up. But there may be clues in that telemetry that engineers analyzing this over coming weeks and months will be able to pinpoint a sequence of events. Then, of course, there will be attempts to salvage the pieces, both by those people who were jumping into the water instantly, and I'm sure there will be divers out there if it's not too deep, and maybe there will be clues in some of that. The chances are pretty good. In Apollo 13, as we mentioned earlier, it was very complicated, and they eventually figured it out down to a certain switch that failed.
We'll take some other viewer calls in a moment, but just speaking personally, when I heard this news, all of our minds go to a specific thing. Each has an individual reaction. My initial reaction was to think of the children watching at that school. I mean, it gives you such a horrible feeling. Let's go to the phone right now. Dr. Lee Salk. Talk to Dr. Salk, a child psychologist, about the students who are watching their teacher fly away and ultimately get blown up. Are you with us, Dr. Salk?
Yes, I am.
Dr. Salk, what's your thoughts about how these children are reacting to this seeming unreal picture of a rocket exploding with their teacher on board?
Well, needless to say, it's great shock. I think that all the children watching were anticipating, a moment in history, something which we all felt and shared. And to see this horrible, unforeseen tragedy take place is indeed a shock. I think it's going to be very important for these children to talk out their feelings, to have adults who can listen to them and encourage them to express their feelings. I think it's important for them to realize that it's going to take time for this shock to wear off. I would anticipate that many of these children are going to have nightmares. They're going to find it very difficult to do some of their studies and so on until the grief reaction, which will set in after this initial shock, begins to take hold.
Dr. Salk, as we know, life is so often is tragically unfair. How does one explain such a thing to a child? That this is an accident, that these things can happen, without scaring a child practically to death or intimidating a child to get on an airplane or to get in a car or to put him or herself in any potentially dangerous situation or a situation where he or she relies on technology?
Well, there are going to be some children who, particularly sensitive children who may have some worries and anxieties to begin with, who are going to find it particularly difficult, and it may very well precipitate some phobic reactions in children where they'll be reluctant to do things. But somehow or other, I think they'll be able to distance themselves from it emotionally. Children do have the capacity to rebound from some of these things, and they employ their own psychological defenses to, in some ways, even deny that it even happened. I mean, some of them may see it almost as if it's something that they see on Saturday television in cartoons.
That's actually the next question I had, Dr. Salk, is that the first reaction of the children, as reported on CNN, I believe, was, this can't be real, this actually can't be happening, that they couldn't necessarily equate what they were seeing, that horrible explosion on the monitor, with the person whom they loved and adored, who probably was standing there in the class a month ago.
Yeah, yeah. I think that is certainly the initial reaction, disbelief, denial, until it finally does set in. I think that it's important to recognize these people as heroes. I think that they volunteered for this. I think they did a service to this country. Every precaution was taken that was possible, and I think they have to realize that accidents do occur, and this was indeed one, and the track record has been a very fine one. And the reason that they delay these flights is because of the fact that they want to make sure everything is in working order, and these things just do happen in the same way that accidents occur with automobiles and so on. But I think it's important also to help them understand that these people, when they died, were at a moment of great excitement, and they probably was painless. They probably didn't know what hit them, and that they died at a moment when
actually true.
When they were excited and a happy moment. And when one can visualize the ways in which people do die, that in many ways these people will go down in history and have made a contribution, as tragic as it is.
Dr. Salk, thank you very much for joining us on the phone. Why don't we take a break and continue our discussion of the tragic explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back. Continuing with Ken Gilmore, the editor of Popular Science magazine, and Gurney Williams, the editor of Omni magazine, who are with us right now as we discuss some of the implications of the explosion, the tragic explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, and we really can't get into speculating on the why of this. Let's go to some viewer calls with either questions or reactions. Bill Boggs with you here on Midday. Hello.
Oh, good day, gentlemen.
Yes.
Regina from Manhattan.
Hi.
Okay, hi. I'd like to know, one, our idea was to go to the moon and investigate it, find out everything about what's going on up there, and then maybe go on to something else. How come you dropped the moon immediately and went on to something else? You didn't complete one thing before you went to shuttling people, and not to say that it's not wrong, but everyone is taking a different proportion in life. The teacher should have been in a classroom to some degree, because you are talking about a life and death situation. They might have got up there and never came back.
Good. You have a lot of interesting reactions there. Let's start with the second. That was it. Whose idea was it to put a teacher in space? Was this NASA wanted to put a civilian in space, or was it President Reagan's idea? I know he's very close to the space program.
It was certainly something, Bill, that Reagan staked his prestige on and backed very firmly. And I think one question related to this is what Reagan is going through right now, because it is often attributed to Reagan as his idea. And here's a man who has to give a State of the Union message tonight facing that knowledge.
Right. And the first part of the question is an interesting one, too. We went to the moon. We won the race to the moon. There's only been one man to walk on the moon. No, I'm wrong. Right.
No, we had 6 or 7
landings.
landings.
To the moon. Oh, landings.
Yes,
right.
yes.
Then we did not abandon it. We did what we needed to do, or was it abandoned?
The Apollo program was envisioned as a 6 to 8 mission program, and that was accomplished. In the meantime, these things start 8, 10, 15 years ahead of time, working up to them. Many other programs, the unmanned ones we were talking about, the Voyagers and the Pioneers, then the Space Shuttle, you know, all of these things overlap one after the other. And so that program accomplished basically its mission, and it was decided by people who make such decisions, you can argue whether they're the right ones or not, that we had accomplished, that the money, any further money would better be spent elsewhere rather than continuing to go back to the moon.
Okay, let's take thank you for that call. Let's take another viewer call. Hello, Bill Boggs with you on Midday.
Hello, my name is Dorothy. I'm from Brooklyn.
Yes.
And I'd just like to make the comment that I hope that this tragedy doesn't inhibit the Space Shuttle program, because I think the human being is a curious creature, and we shouldn't leave all our searching to machines. And also that the Space Shuttle program appears to be necessary if we're ever to have a permanent station on the moon, or a permanent space station, or either do further exploration of the moon or Mars or our solar system at any reasonable cost, with the possibility of human beings being involved.
All right, thank you. What's your reaction here?
Apollo 13 did not kill anyone, but it came very close to killing 3 men. They got back, and they found the problem and fixed it and went on with the space program, and I would assume that the likelihood is that the same thing will happen here. Do you agree?
I do. Science has always been a quest. It's always involved risk, from the man going out into Africa to trace terrible diseases, to the space program, to the early days of flight, as you point out, Ken. And it is not to be assumed that quests are without risks. And this goes all the way back to the Iliad and Odyssey and the oldest stories we know. And the space program is one of those stories.
Right, and continuing in that great tradition. Is there any possibility that something like this could be a work of sabotage or terrorism? Or is that area so secure that you would say that it is indeed a enormously remote possibility?
Enormously remote. Oh. If a terrorist were trying to do something like this, I suspect he'd go out and blow it up on the pad. You know, this would have to be a very complex sort of. No, I think that's not really a.
Back to another viewer on the line. Bill Boggs with you on Midday. Hello.
Yes, hello, Bill. This is Kathy from Nutley.
Yes.
I'd like to say what the gentleman from Omni was saying. People in this country where they take risk, they go out, they do what they have to do. This is our nature. What I was wondering is, one of the flights was canceled because the computer had found something that was not right with the shuttle that the human eye did not see. I was wondering if something like this could have been projected before the flight, if the shuttle was checked over, whether the computers had found anything at all.
Computers, of course, continuously monitor what's going on the shuttle, and it's likely, I would think, that something came up and probably the computer picked it up as soon as it arose. As to whether other precautions could have been taken, well, obviously, I would say, yes, something else could have been done, and we hope to find the answer as to what that was.
Gentlemen, let's take another break. I thank you for that call. We'll be back right after this, and we have a substantial news update coming along in just a few moments, so stay with us. Welcome back. We're concluding Midday, and even as we speak, a news update, a substantial news update is being prepared. So in conclusion, we have been speaking during our Midday today with Ken Gilmore, the editor of Popular Science magazine, and Gurney Williams, the editor of Omni magazine. And let's just, assuming that there probably have been some people who've turned on during the course of our review, basically what we know about what happened today.
Well, the space shuttle was launched after several delays, and a minute and a half or a little bit longer after launch, it simply blew up for reasons that have not yet been determined. It is presumed that all aboard are dead, though since we've been here for some time, I have not heard the final evidence on that.
And Gurney, at this point, is pure speculation, I would assume, as to come to some kind of understanding as to why the craft did explode.
No one at this point is going to know, and I suspect it's going to be a long time before we know about what happened. But obviously our thoughts are with the families of the 7 people who died today.
How long might such an investigation take before NASA is able to inform the public as to why this happened?
With a typical airplane crash, it can take months, sometimes longer. We just have no idea at this point.
Fragments scattered all around.
Fragments, evaluation of the telemetry, of the data that has been that have been sent back, it's going to take a long time.
And often when a clue comes, then they go back and reenact on other equipment to see what happened, and put the whole thing together in a very, it could take many months.
And as you said at the very beginning, I think of my second question to you, the craft is the most complex vehicle on Earth today. So
hundreds of thousands of things have to go right.
A list of the parts, Bill, for that craft fills a book that's roughly a foot high in NASA headquarters in Washington.
How many other craft like this are in existence now in NASA?
Is it 3?
I believe it's 3 now, and more planned. It's always been a debate as to whether there would be 4 or 5.
Right. Well, gentlemen, I thank you very much for coming, obviously on short notice, and for enduring with us through what is certainly a grim and a tragic day, and I appreciate your being with us and helping us through this. I thank you. We'll take a break right now. Actually throw it over to Jim and Judy for a first edition news update.